Not since the Jimmy Carter administration has an administration had as many serious foreign policy blunders in such a short period of time. The Biden administration came in the first week in office, ended the Remain in Mexico policy, which has prompted the worst illegal immigration crisis in 20 years. In the Middle East, the Biden administration inherited a flowering of peace with the historic Abraham Accords. And the Biden administration came in and began undermining our friend and ally, the State of Israel, sent over $250 million to the Palestinian Authority, which is in bed with Hamas, which announced even this week that they are continuing to fund the families of terrorists who murder innocent civilians, and they're now doing so in effect because money is fungible with U.S. taxpayer dollars. And as a result of those foreign policy blunders, what had been historic peace became war in recent weeks in the Middle East. But I think there's no area in which the foreign policy blunders have been greater than concerning Russia and Nord Stream 2. You are not surprised that I'm making this point to you today. I think it is useful to pause for a moment and reflect on the successes we had as a nation concerning Russia and Nord Stream 2 and just how President Biden has given those away. In the summer and fall of 2019, I introduced in this committee bipartisan sanctions to stop the construction of Nord Stream 2, the natural gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. I did so along with Senator Shaheen. It was overwhelmingly bipartisan. Indeed, every Democrat on this committee supported it, and all but one Republican on this committee supported it. At the time, there was considerable Russian disinformation being pushed in Europe. The Russian disinformation said the pipeline is nearly complete. As they said later that year, the pipeline is 90% complete. You cannot stop it. The sanctions cannot work. The Russians pushed that relentlessly. We now know that disinformation was a lie. The Congress passed that bipartisan legislation into law. It was signed into law, if my memory serves me correctly, at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. At 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the president signed those bipartisan sanctions into law, the company building the pipeline announced they were immediately halting construction. So the Russian disinformation was exactly that. It was a lie, and the sanctions worked. From that moment, for the next year, the pipeline lay dormant and fallow, and there was no construction. The next year, in December of 2020, I introduced, along with Senator Shaheen, a second wave of bipartisan sanctions that passed into law, ratcheting up the punishment even more. And then, unfortunately, the Biden administration came in and turned this incredible bipartisan victory for America into a colossal failure. It started in November, shortly after the election in 2020, when an individual, Nicholas Burns, who was identified as an advisor to then President-elect Biden, told a German newspaper that, quote, the Americans must suspend sanctions in return for a temporary halt to Nord Stream 2. Now, that message from the incoming Biden team was heard loud and clear, which is why the Moscow Times quoted the German foreign minister as saying, of course, we are very interested in discussing the Nord Stream 2 topic with the new administration in Washington. That initial sign of weakness was heard, and in late December, the Russians resumed construction. For a year it had been dormant. Late December, they resumed construction in German waters. But it wasn't yet done. The second wave of sanctions that we passed into law still gave them pause. They threatened to resume construction in deep-sea Danish waters on January 15th. But they didn't dare. They didn't dare because they believed the outgoing Trump administration would impose sanctions. And they recommenced construction of the pipeline in Danish waters on January 24th, 5 days after President Biden was sworn into office. They did so because they were convinced that the Biden administration would not enforce the sanctions. You sat before this committee and promised you would use every tool you have to stop the pipeline. You sat in my office and promised, you and I discussed this at great length in my office, you promised you would use every tool you have to stop the pipeline. You put out a public statement in March that explicitly warned, quote, any entity involved in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline risks U.S. sanctions and should immediately abandon work on the pipeline. But then, unfortunately, the Biden administration decided to waive those sanctions